So Richard Dawkins just went back on Piers Morgan's show, and it went about as well as you could expect.
Are you suggesting that I shouldn't take anything you say in this book seriously, Richard Dawkins?
Oh, come on. You're being so sort of unreasonable.
I thought we'd take a look at the first bit of this conversation and see what we might learn.
For what it's worth, I do believe in God. I do believe in an afterlife. I find it comforting. I also find, as I said to you last time, I find it explains things which are otherwise completely inexplicable. And we had a guest on recently, Professor Stephen C. Meyer, who's a prominent believer in intelligent design, or what he calls the God hypothesis. He watched our last interview that you and I had, and this is what he said about it.
Dawkins wants to portray theistic belief as if it's equivalent to belief in fairies, and he'll concede that, well, it's possible. But I think there's a stronger argument for the theistic case. And that is that when scientists and philosophers reason from evidence, they typically use a method of reasoning that has a technical name. It's called inferring to the best explanation, where the best explanation is one where you're invoking a cause which has the kind of powers that would be required to explain the phenomenon of interest. And you correctly pointed out in your conversation with him that when you get back to that, what physicists often call the singularity, the point where matter, space, time, and energy begin to exist, the materialist is really up against a huge conundrum, because prior to the origin of matter, there is no matter to do the causing. That's what we mean by the origin of matter, that's where it starts.
Right.
And so if you want to invoke a cause which is sufficient to explain the origin of matter, you can't invoke matter. It's in principle, the materialistic explanations are in principle insufficient. So you need to invoke something which is external to the material universe and is not bounded by time and space as well. And that starts to paint a picture of the kind of cause you would need that has the sort of attributes the traditional theists have traditionally associated with God.
So Piers presents an argument from Stephen Meyer that whatever causes the universe must be spaceless and timeless, because of course the universe contains space and time. I think it's worth just pointing out that of course this relies on the principle of causation, the idea that causes must come before effects. Everything that happens, anything that begins to exist must have some kind of cause. But the Big Bang is a very strange time in the universe's history where the laws of physics kind of seem to break down. There are all kinds of things which seem to stop working at a singularity. And also, if the Big Bang really is the beginning of the material universe, it's worth bearing in mind that although it was once thought that there are 3 dimensions of space and then this separate thing called time, which we all sort of move through, since it was really popularized by Einstein, although thought of by a few scientists before him, time is now considered to be a dimension of space. Space-time is one 4-dimensional continuum. That would mean that at the Big Bang, time itself came into existence. The principle of causality that we might rely on to say that any effect requires some kind of cause says that effects must come after their causes. Effects can't come before their own causes. But these kinds of rules rely on some conception of time. To even have rules about things happening before and after one another, you already need to have time. And so if the principle of causation relies on there being some notion of time, then it might not be something that applies outside of the universe and before, or rather outside of, the Big Bang. Now, of course, that's kind of impossible to wrap our heads around, and it's still perfectly possible that causation exists outside of time and space. That's perfectly possible and may even be plausible. I don't know. All I'm saying is that it's worth mentioning this in response to what Stephen Meyer had to say before considering Piers Morgan and Richard Dawkins. Speaking of incomprehensible things, it's amazing to me that so many people still don't know how to protect their data from the prying eyes of hackers, internet service providers, and other malicious actors. The way to do that is by using a VPN like Private Internet Access, today's sponsor. If you're browsing on an unencrypted Wi-Fi network, such as in a coffee shop or a hotel lobby, hackers on that same network can steal your data, your passwords, your keystrokes, even your photos. Private Internet Access helps secure your private data by rerouting your data through a separate secure server somewhere else in the world. It hides your IP address and protects your personal information against those who are trying to steal it. And because this rerouting makes it seem like you're somewhere else in the world, you can access content that's usually restricted by region. So if there's a show that's only available on US Netflix and I live in the UK, that's not a problem anymore. Even on YouTube, sometimes you're told you're not allowed to watch a video in your region. Private Internet Access can solve that problem for you. And PIA never record or store user data. Their no-logs policy has even been proven multiple times in court via a third-party audit from Deloitte. Using the internet without PIA is like boxing without protective gear. You might be fine, but it just takes one well-placed punch to knock you right on the floor. Try it out for yourself and protect an unlimited number of devices from one subscription by going to piavpn.com/Alex. Use my link to get 83% off a subscription for as little as $2.03 a month, as well as getting 4 months extra for free. With that said, back to Piers.
But when you go back to the very start, what is there before that? And that, I think I asked you last time, and Professor Meyer brought that up again as being the flaw in your position, which is what is there before it starts? What is nothing?
This is a question for a physicist, not a biologist, but what I would answer to Professor Meyer is that we need to explain complexity in terms of simplicity. And of course it's true that I cannot say what was there before the Big Bang. Physicists sometimes tell us that the word before doesn't even mean anything before the Big Bang. But whatever it was,
but it has to, doesn't it?
You cannot suddenly invoke...
Doesn't it have to? I mean, someone as logical as you are, and I believe you are, you think about this all very logically. A logical mind surely has to appreciate that before the Big Bang, there has to have been something before then. Otherwise, what is nothing?
Richard just said, look, it might not make sense to ask what came before the Big Bang. And Piers asks, well, why not?
A physicist will tell you that...
But what do you tell me?
I'm trying to tell you what a physicist would say, first of all. They would say that you cannot use the word before for the Big Bang. Time began at the Big Bang. There was no before the Big Bang. I know it's contrary to common sense. Physicists don't necessarily deal with common sense.
Well, it makes no sense, does it? And that's what I mean. I think you're a logical man. That cannot make sense to you. The idea that you're not even allowed to use the word before the Big Bang, when every part of both of our brains tells us that that's obviously nonsensical, doesn't that make you think again?
Well, I don't know if every part of both of their brains thinks that's nonsensical. I mean, the most famous analogy that's provided for this thought, and I think Dawkins provides it himself in his earlier conversation with Piers Morgan, is the concept of north. It might seem that wherever you are on the planet, a compass seems to point in the direction of north. And it doesn't matter where you go, it's always pointing towards the north. And so you can keep following that compass, and you'll keep going more and more north, and more north, until you get to the North Pole. And the North Pole, in this analogy, is like the Big Bang. If I were to ask, well, what's north of the North Pole? You'd look at me like I didn't understand what I was talking about. Similarly, if we see the Big Bang as the origin of the universe, and therefore the origin of time itself, then we can simply rephrase this question as, what came before the beginning of time? And I suppose if I asked that question, even Piers, with all of his common sense, would be able to tell me that that's maybe not a legitimate question.
We are not physicists. I, like you, am completely baffled by what physicists say to me, which is that you cannot use the word before for before the Big Bang. Time itself began at the Big Bang. Now that is totally counterintuitive. It's counterintuitive to me. It's counterintuitive to you. It's counterintuitive to Stephen Meyer. But we are not physicists. And you need to talk to a physicist. Talk to a physicist about that. And they will tell you that you cannot use the word before for the Big Bang.
Yeah, but you think that's as preposterous as I do.
I do, because I'm not a physicist.
You've just written a book as a biologist called The Genetic Book of the Dead, in which you talk about the body and the genome, comprehensive dossiers and so on. So you're prepared to expound a philosophy based on that as a biologist, which I completely respect, and it makes perfect sense. The book makes perfect sense the way that you have written it. But why would you then think that a physicist cannot be contradicted just simply because they're a physicist? I could contradict what you say as a biologist.
No, you really aren't getting it. I'm so sorry. Modern physics is exceedingly mysterious. It really is. I mean, have you tried to read some of the difficult modern physics books? It really is very difficult to understand. And intuition doesn't do it. You cannot use human intuition. Human intuition was built up by evolution over many millions of years to survive on the African plain, hunting and gathering, looking for waterholes, looking for mates and so on. Our brains were not built to understand the profundities of the origin of the universe, the end of the universe, the kind of things that physicists deal with. I think it's actually amazing that at least some human brains are capable of dealing with this kind of stuff. My brain isn't, and nor is yours.
No, but that's my point, though.
I wish it were.
Well, yeah, I wish both our brains could. But the truth is, it's because the human brain can't comprehend this, including, I don't think, any physicist. Because the moment they say you can't have before the Big Bang, they lose me completely just on a common sense perspective. It's that reason that I think there has to be a power that is greater than the human brain.
Again, Piers seems like he doesn't even want to consider why it might be that someone like Richard Dawkins, or indeed a physicist, might say you can't have a before the Big Bang. But think about this for a moment. Doesn't the theist have the same problem? Let's look again at the clip of Stephen Meyer that Piers played at the beginning of the interview.
If you want to invoke a cause which is sufficient to explain the origin of matter, you can't invoke matter. It's in principle, the materialistic explanations are in principle insufficient. So you need to invoke something which is external to the material universe and is not bounded by time and space as well.
Whatever caused the Big Bang must be spaceless and timeless. It must exist outside of space and time. Well, hold on a second. Doesn't that mean I can say to Stephen Meyer and then Piers Morgan, who's nodding approvingly, well, what came before the Big Bang? I think Stephen Meyer and Piers would have to say, well, because the Big Bang was the beginning of space and time itself, God doesn't really exist before the Big Bang. He sort of exists outside of the Big Bang because, God is outside of time. So it doesn't really make sense to say he came before the Big Bang because the Big Bang is the beginning of time. And in other words, they've got the same problem as the atheist does. It also doesn't make sense for the theist. So even Stephen Meyer would have to say that the question, what came before the Big Bang, doesn't really make sense. It's just that when we get to thinking if there's something logically prior to the Big Bang or outside of the Big Bang, or however you want to think about it, when someone says that the answer is nothing, that doesn't make much sense. But when someone says the answer is God, that makes a lot more sense. So if Piers can't wrap his head around the fact that there's no before the Big Bang, I think he's going to have a difficult time wrapping his head around the atemporal God who exists outside of space and time itself. But like I say, even if Piers is wrong about this particular point, he might be right that it's ludicrous to suggest nothing caused the universe. Why does Piers think this?
The reason that I subscribe to the theory there must be a more powerful being out there than anything the human race has created is because, like I say, a human brain can't comprehend nothingness or what may have come before nothingness. We can't. We're not able to extrapolate what that is, right? I mean, no scientist can explain nothingness, can they?
So Piers is struggling with the concept of nothing, which is perfectly understandable, of course, because it seems like you can't really think about nothing. If nothing is truly nothing, it's not something you can think about. But Piers seems to be suggesting that because our brains can't comprehend something, it therefore can't exist or can't obtain or can't be the case. I mean, there is a sense in which my brain simply can't think of nothing, but in the same way, I can't think of, say, not an elephant. I can't think of the concept of, no elephants, because in order to focus on the concept of no elephants, I have to have this concept of an elephant in my head. And so while it's possible for there to actually be no elephants in my cognitive perception, I can't conceive of this abstract concept of no elephants, because in order to do so, I kind of have to think about an elephant. But we shouldn't confuse our inability to picture something or comprehend something or entertain an idea with its impossibility. After all, it's possible for there to be no elephants. But just think about that concept of no elephants for a moment. Are you thinking of an elephant? But my real gripe with this is that Piers Morgan is a Catholic, and Catholics have a very particular belief about the nature of God, specifically that God is split into three persons, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Famously, whilst the Father is God, and the Son is God, and the Holy Spirit is God, the Father is not the Son, and the Son is not the Holy Spirit, and the Holy Spirit is not the Father. This famously has been a logical challenge for Christians for thousands of years. Now, there are all kinds of different solutions to the concept of the Trinity, but no one can deny that it's at the very least a very counterintuitive and difficult concept for the human brain to consider. How can three persons exist as one God? If I were to ask this to Piers Morgan, I don't know what he would say, but he would at least have to admit that it's, unintuitive, maybe running slightly contrary to common sense. And in fact, maybe he would say something like, look, I'm not a theologian. You're better off asking a theologian. There are people much more intelligent than me that might have an answer to that question, but maybe no one really knows or fully understands the nature of God, but I guess that's just one of the great mysteries of my faith. And the problem is, if Piers is allowed to do something like that for something like the Trinity, then why shouldn't Richard Dawkins be able to do the same thing for the Big Bang? It did just strike me watching this that if Piers is unable to believe that Dawkins' worldview might be true because it contains this incomprehensible and mysterious element, then I would just want to ask Piers, can you explain the Trinity to me? Can you explain the problem of divine hiddenness? Can you explain the problem of evil? Can you explain why children get cancer? Can you explain why you're statistically more likely to believe in God if you're born in Rwanda than if you're born in Thailand? Does God just naturally reveal himself more to the Rwandans than to the Thai? Are the Thai just naturally more resistant for some reason? And if so, is that their fault? The bottom line is that all comprehensive worldviews have things that they just can't explain. And if anybody tells you they've got a worldview that says it can explain everything, that person is not to be trusted. So where Piers says that Dawkins has this strange, unintuitive implication of his worldview that makes it difficult for him to believe in what he's saying, I can only say that he should take the log out of his own eye. Now, of course, this isn't to say that some mysteries aren't more troubling than others, but Piers seems to be suggesting that merely his difficulty grasping the concept of nothing is enough to make him disbelieve in atheism, whilst simultaneously subscribing to a worldview that has all kinds of mysteries embedded within it that, if you ask me, are much more difficult to explain on paper than the concept of nothingness. I mean, here's one way of thinking about what nothing is that I saw somewhere on social media recently. What can you see out of your elbow? Nothing. Or close one of your eyes. What do you see out of that eye? Nothing. You don't see black, you just see nothing. That's nothing. That's what it is. Can you offer me a similar way to understand the Trinity? Piers Morgan probably can't, but here's the thing, I'm sure there are many theologians who can. And just because I can't conceive of the Trinity when talking to Piers Morgan, doesn't mean I should dismiss his entire worldview because there's one element of it that he can't fully explain, whilst simultaneously admitting that it's a question from a field that he's not an expert in. Likewise, the inability of Richard Dawkins, an evolutionary biologist, to explain the concept of nothingness to Piers Morgan, or talk about what happened before the Big Bang, which is, of course, a physicist's question, shouldn't make us dismiss his entire worldview either. Perhaps Piers should invite a physicist onto his show, as Richard continually suggests that he does, but even if he does, he should also bear in mind that even if he can't get a satisfying answer from an atheist physicist about what came before the Big Bang or what nothingness is, it might not be because the atheist physicist has the wrong worldview, but instead because it's simply a question that no human being at present can currently answer, and that does not warrant the invention of a god in order to fill in that gap. Or to put it another way, there are fewer things in heaven and earth, Piers, than are dreamt of in your philosophy. To get early access, ad-free to videos, and support the channel, subscribe to my Substack at alexoconnor.com. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.